At first glance, he looked like the kind of man no one would ever pay attention to. A worn-out backpack, a soft smile, neatly folded boarding pass in his hand, and the calm face of someone who had traveled many times before. When he stepped into the busy terminal that morning, he blended so naturally into the crowd that even the security cameras almost seemed to drift past him without interest. People around him were rushing, dragging luggage, searching for gates, greeting family, but he moved with a quiet confidence, like he had rehearsed every step of this journey long before he arrived. Asterisk for most travelers, airport security was just another routine. Take out your electronics, remove your shoes, walk through the scanner, pick up your things, and go. But for him, it was a test, a dangerous one, and only he knew what would happen if he failed. Asterisk, he checked the time again, not because he was in a hurry, but because he seemed to be counting something silently. Moments, steps, chances. His eyes stayed away from the security officers as he joined the line, trying to appear as ordinary as the people around him. A mother calming her child, a businessman talking on his phone, a couple discussing their honeymoon. All normal, all harmless, and he tried to blend into that same harmless picture. But deep inside, he knew something no one else standing near him knew. If the airport scanners detected even one small detail wrong, his life, the life he had worked so hard to hide, would collapse right there in front of everyone. Asterisk, when he finally reached the conveyor belt, he placed his backpack down carefully, almost too carefully, as if even the smallest shake might create a problem. Then he slipped off his watch, emptied his pockets, and looked straight ahead at the body scanner. His breathing slowed, his heartbeat picked up, but his face stayed calm. Years of practice had taught him how to pretend. Asterisk, nearby officers didn't think much of him. They had seen thousands of people every day, and to them he was just another traveler heading to another destination. But one thing about airports is simple. Machines don't miss what human eyes overlook. They don't get tired, they don't get distracted, and they don't make assumptions. Asterisk, the conveyor belt pulled his backpack inside the X-ray tunnel. A moment later, the screen beside the machine lit up with the usual black and white shapes: clothes, toiletries, a small book, and something else. Something faint, something that made the security operator lean closer for a better look. At first, she thought it might be a technical glitch. Sometimes shadows overlapped. Sometimes objects looked strange from certain angles. But as she rotated the view and zoomed in, her eyebrows pulled together in confusion. Asterisk, it wasn't what she expected. It wasn't what anyone expected. Asterisk, the man, unaware of what had appeared on the screen, stepped into the full-body scanner with his hands slightly raised. He was steady. He was prepared. He tried not to blink too much, but even his steady breathing couldn't protect him from what was already happening on the other side of the glass window. Asterisk, the security operator signaled another officer to come closer. She pointed at the screen, whispering something only he could hear. He didn't react loudly, but his face tightened. He took a slow breath and nodded. The two officers exchanged a silent understanding. Something wasn't right. Not enough to panic, but enough to check. Asterisk, inside the scanner, the man's eyes flickered toward them. He noticed the whispering, the small pause in routine, the way the officer's attention had shifted from the line to the screen. And even though he didn't move, he felt the change in atmosphere immediately. A cold realization washed through him. They had seen something. Asterisk, the scanner beeped softly as it completed its sweep. He stepped out, pretending nothing was wrong, pretending he didn't see the officers watching him more closely now. He walked toward the table where passengers usually waited for their bags. But his backpack didn't come out. It stayed hidden inside the machine longer than normal. Much longer. Asterisk, another officer approached the conveyor belt, pressed a button, and stopped it. The man's calm expression slipped for the first time. Just slightly, but in a place filled with cameras trained to observe even slight changes mattered. Asterisk, a third officer stepped closer to him, offering a polite smile, the kind of smile officers give when they already know something is off but don't want to cause alarm. "Sir, can you wait here for a moment?" he asked gently. Asterisk, his throat tightened. He nodded slowly, trying to maintain the polite traveler act. Around him, people continued walking past, unaware that a silent storm was forming only a few feet away. Asterisk, another minute passed. Then another. He kept glancing at the machine, waiting for his backpack to appear. But instead of the bag, two more officers approached the scanning station. They weren't running, they weren't shouting, but their arrival alone told him everything he needed to know. This was no longer a random delay. This was a problem, a big one. Asterisk, the officer returned to him with a calm voice. "Sir, do you mind coming with us for a secondary screening?" he asked. Asterisk, secondary screening. The words hit him like a punch he wasn't prepared for. His fingers tightened around the edge of the table. He tried to think fast, too fast. Should he stay calm? Should he explain something? Should he hope the item they saw wasn't clear enough? Should he try to act confused? Should he run? Asterisk, no. He couldn't run. Not here. Not in an airport filled with cameras, security officers, and checkpoints every 10 steps. Asterisk, he forced a small smile and nodded again. but inside, everything was falling apart. He followed them quietly through a side door, away from the noise of the terminal, away from the innocent travelers who would never guess what was unfolding just a few meters away. Behind him. The conveyor belt moved again for the other passengers, but his backpack stayed locked inside the machine, still displaying that strange, suspicious shape on the monitor, the shape that would soon expose the secret life he had spent years trying to bury. And as the officers closed the door behind him, something inside him whispered the truth he didn't want to face. This time, he might not walk away. He followed the officers through a narrow hallway that felt too quiet compared to the loud, crowded terminal he had just walked through. The walls were plain, the lights a little dimmer, and every step he took echoed softly like a reminder that he was walking deeper into something he couldn't escape. The officer in front didn't speak much, only giving short instructions like this way or just a little further. The silence between them felt heavy, almost intentional, like they wanted him to feel every second of it. He tried to slow his breathing, to keep his expression calm, but his mind was running in circles. He kept replaying the moment the operator stopped the conveyor belt. What exactly had they seen? Was it clear? Was it enough to question him, or was it enough to expose everything? When they entered a small room with a table, a chair, and a scanner monitor in the corner, he felt his stomach twist. The room wasn't threatening, but it was isolating, the kind of place where people were asked questions they couldn't walk away from. The officer gestured for him to sit. "We just need to go over a few things," he said politely. He nodded again, pretending everything was normal. He didn't want to make the officers suspicious by looking nervous, but he also knew that trying too hard to appear relaxed could look even worse. He folded his hands to stop them from shaking, and he stared at the table, waiting for the questions he feared. While an officer stepped outside to bring his backpack, another started asking basic things: his name, where he was traveling, how long his trip was. All routine questions, but even routine questions can feel heavy when you're hiding something. His answers were calm, steady, almost memorized. He had prepared for this. He had practiced these details many times. The way some people practice speeches, but as he answered, the officer studying him didn't look away. He watched every movement, every blink, every pause. Officers were trained to read people, and this one, in particular, seemed like he had seen 100 faces just like his. Faces trying to hide their real stories behind simple words. A moment later, the door opened again and the officer from the scanner room returned, holding his backpack. It wasn't handed back to him. Instead, it was placed carefully on the table, like an object that needed examination. The man's heart stumbled. He stared at it, trying to guess what angle the scanner must have caught: a corner, a shadow, something too small for anyone else to notice but too important to ignore. The officer cleared his throat. "We need to take another look at something we saw during screening," he said gently. "It may be nothing, but we need clarity." He nodded again, but this time he didn't bother trying to hide the tension in his shoulders. Pretending too much would only look worse. "Of course," he said, forcing a polite tone. The officer unzipped the backpack slowly. The sound of the zipper felt strangely loud in the small room. One pocket at a time, he took out the visible items: clothes, charger, book. Everything looked normal. Everything looked harmless. But the officers weren't interested in the things he wanted them to see. They were interested in what he didn't. As the search continued, his mind drifted back, not because he wanted to remember, but because he couldn't stop himself. It had all started years ago, far before any airport scanner had a chance to catch up to him. Back then, he wasn't running. He wasn't hiding. He was just trying to survive a life that felt stacked against him from the beginning. He didn't grow up around luxury or stability. His world was small, and every day felt like a fight to protect the little he had. Life had taught him early that people often survive by doing things they never imagined they would. He had once dreamed of traveling freely, seeing new places, starting fresh somewhere far away. But as he grew older, life had pulled him in a different direction. One by one, his choices had piled up. Choices that were supposed to be temporary. Choices he told himself he would undo someday. But someday never came. And those choices eventually became chapters he couldn't erase. He tried to push the memories away. Before they showed on his face, the officer searching his bag lifted a small pouch that had been tucked into the corner. The pouch was normal. Common, actually. Many travelers kept small items in them, but the officer paused, weighing it in his hand. The man swallowed hard, trying not to stare too directly at it. The pouch wasn't the problem. The problem was the suspicion it created. The officer opened it slowly, then exhaled. It was empty, just a pouch. Nothing else? The man felt a brief wave of relief wash over him, but it didn't last long. The officer studying the monitor stepped closer and spoke quietly to the others. His tone wasn't harsh, but it wasn't casual either. Whatever he said made the other officer nod. Then the officer looked at the man and said, "We're going to need to run your bag through another scanner." There was an area inside the lining that didn't show clearly. It could just be fabric overlap. It happens sometimes. Asterisk fabric overlap. He wished that were true. Asterisk the officer picked up the backpack and stepped out. Now he was alone in the room with one officer standing near the door. The silence between them grew heavier. He tried not to look impatient or scared, but inside, he could feel the panic slowly rising, quiet but sharp. Asterisk. He closed his eyes for a moment and tried to remember why he had come this far, why he had taken this risk, why he thought this journey might finally change something. He wasn't trying to hurt anyone, he wasn't trying to cause trouble, he just wanted a new beginning in a place where he didn't have to live in fear of his past chasing him. Asterisk, but new beginnings don't come easily for people who carry secrets. Asterisk, after a long minute, the door opened again. The officer returned, carrying the backpack, but he wasn't alone. Another officer followed him inside, holding a printed copy of the new scanner image. They placed it on the table, turning it so he could see. Asterisk, he tried to prepare himself, but nothing prepared him for the image on the paper. Asterisk, the shapes were faint, but visible enough for trained eyes to notice the unusual pattern buried deep inside the inner layer of the bag. It wasn't sharp, it wasn't clear, but it was inconsistent, the kind of inconsistency scanners were designed to flag. Asterisk. The officer tapped the shaded area with his finger. This is what we need clarity on, he said. It could be nothing. Sometimes older bags have reinforced stitching or dense materials. But we need to check the lining. The lining. He felt his throat go dry. He nodded again, but his hands tightened in his lap. The officer picked up a small inspection tool and moved the bag toward him. Asterisk, we just need to open a bit of the inside layer. The officer said calmly. Procedure. Procedure, a simple word that now felt like the heaviest threat in the room. The man wanted to stop them. He wanted to explain something. He wanted to make it all sound like a misunderstanding. But he knew any attempt to talk now would only make things worse. Every second stretched longer than the last as the officer examined the inner seams. Asterisk, the tool slid under the edge of the lining. The officer's expression didn't change. He wasn't rushing. He wasn't nervous. He was steady, too steady. Asterisk, and then, he paused. Asterisk, his eyes narrowed slightly. Not shocked, not alarmed, but curious, like he had found something worth looking at more closely. Asterisk, the man's chest tightened. He felt his heartbeat in his throat. The smallest shift in the officer's expression was enough to confirm what he already feared. Asterisk, the secret he had been carrying, the one he had hidden so carefully for so long, was no longer hidden. Asterisk, and in that silent room, with no escape and nowhere to hide, he realized something far worse. This was only the beginning. The officer's small pause felt louder than anything else in the room. It wasn't dramatic or sudden, but the man felt it instantly, like the air had stopped moving for a second. The officer didn't say anything at first. He just leaned in, gently pulling the inner lining a little wider with the inspection tool. His face stayed calm, but his eyes had that focused look, the kind that said he had noticed something unusual. Asterisk, the man tried to keep his expression neutral, but inside, his thoughts were spinning. He had always known this moment could come. He had prepared for it in his mind many times, but preparation is different from reality. In reality, the walls felt closer, the room felt smaller, and every breath felt harder. Asterisk, the officer closest to the door shifted slightly, as if getting ready for instructions. The man noticed the subtle move. He wasn't sure if it meant suspicion or just procedure, but either way, it added to the pressure sitting heavy in his chest. Asterisk, another officer stepped forward and asked, "How old is this bag?" His tone wasn't accusing, but it wasn't casual either. Asterisk, he hesitated. "A few years," he said softly. Asterisk, seen a lot of travel. The officer asked. Asterisk, not really, he replied, knowing even the simplest answer could matter. Asterisk, the officer didn't question him further. Instead, he continued examining the lining, his fingers gently pressing the edge where the scanner had shown the shaded shape. Then he paused again and looked at his colleagues. "There's something here," he said quietly. Asterisk, those three words hit the man harder than anything so far, not because they were loud, but because they weren't. Whispered conclusions often meant real concern, not enough to alarm the traveler, but enough to alert the team. Asterisk, the officers exchanged quick glances. Professional.com, silent communication. They stepped a little closer, tightening the circle around the table without making it obvious. To anyone watching, it would look like routine work, but to the man, every shift, every breath, every slight movement felt like one more door closing around him. Asterisk, the officer reached inside again and gently touched the inner panel. "Feels reinforced," he murmured, "like something's in between the layers." Asterisk, the man swallowed hard. He wanted to say something, anything, but his voice felt locked in his throat. His hands stayed still in his lap, but his heart was racing so loudly he wondered if the officers could hear it. Asterisk, one officer looked at him, expression neutral. "Did you make any repairs to the bag?" he asked. Asterisk, no. The man answered quickly. Too quickly. He immediately wished he had slowed down. Quick answers always sounded nervous. He forced himself to breathe steadily. lowering his gaze so they wouldn't see the panic rising in his eyes. Asterisk, the officers didn't accuse him of anything. They didn't raise their voices. They didn't even look hostile. That calmness made everything scarier. Calmness meant they were following procedure. Procedure meant something inside the bag was suspicious. Suspicion meant investigation. An investigation meant the truth he tried to bury was about to surface. Asterisk, the officer gently ran the tool under the stitching again. We might need to open this section, he said. Asterisk. Another officer nodded. Before we do that, we need to clarify something with him. He turned to the man. Is there anything you're aware of inside this lining? Asterisk, the man could feel his pulse in his fingertips. He took a slow breath, trying not to sound defensive. Not that I know of, he said carefully. He kept his voice soft, controlled, but his words didn't convince him, and he doubted they convinced the officers. Asterisk, the officer studying the scanner, image placed the printout next to the bag. The scanner showed density here, he explained. It doesn't match the rest of the material. Asterisk, density, a harmless word, but in an airport security room, it carried weight. Asterisk, before the officers proceeded, another officer entered the room with a tablet. He started reviewing the man's travel history, tapping through screens quietly. The man watched him with the corner of his eye, trying not to look too curious. The officer's expression stayed unreadable. He wasn't searching for a fight, he was searching for inconsistencies. Asterisk, travel history could reveal a lot. Patterns, gaps, unexpected trips, places people go when they're avoiding something, or someone, and the man had those gaps. He had disappeared for long periods. He had returned with no clear explanation. He had taken short trips that even he couldn't justify if someone asked directly. Everything he had tried to keep separate in his life was now being studied by someone who didn't even know him, but could still see too much. Asterisk, after a few minutes, the officer placed the tablet down. Your travel pattern is a bit unusual, he said gently. Nothing illegal, just irregular. Asterisk, the man swallowed. I travel when I need to, he answered, for personal reasons. Asterisk, of course, the officer said politely, but his tone suggested he wanted more. Asterisk, the silence that followed was tense. The officers looked at one another, then at the bag, then back at the man. Asterisk, finally, the lead officer said, we're going to open the lining carefully. It's standard when the scanner picks up something unclear. Asterisk, the man nodded, though it felt like the hardest movement he had ever made. He watched as the officer slowly and professionally created a small opening in the lining. It wasn't aggressive. It wasn't rushed. It was just careful, controlled, methodical. Asterisk, and then, he stopped for the third time. But this pause was different. He wasn't looking at the bag. He was looking at the man. Asterisk, it wasn't anger. It wasn't accusation. It was something more complicated, a mix of curiosity and concern. Like he wanted to ask a question, he wasn't sure the man was ready to answer. Asterisk, another officer stepped closer. Sensing the shift, what do you see? He asked quietly. Asterisk, the lead officer didn't answer immediately. He glanced back down at the small opening, then back at the man again. Asterisk, the man's chest tightened. He felt trapped, not physically, but emotionally, as if every memory he had tried to bury was being pulled back out by force. Asterisk, he looked away, unable to meet the officer's eyes anymore. The room felt like it was closing in around him. He felt the weight of his past pressing on his shoulders, threatening to spill out in front of strangers who only saw his actions, not the story behind them. Asterisk, the officer finally said, there's definitely something between the layers. We need to examine it further. Asterisk, he didn't say what it was. He didn't describe it. He didn't confirm anything. Asterisk, but the way he said something was enough. It wasn't confusion anymore. It wasn't a random check. It was confirmation that whatever was hidden inside that lining had been found, at least partly. Asterisk. The man could feel the shift inside himself too. He knew what was coming. The questions, the explanations, the possibility of being held, the fear of losing everything he had tried to build. But the worst part wasn't the investigation. Asterisk, the worst part was knowing that the truth, once opened, could never be closed again. Asterisk, the officer prepared tools for the next step. Another officer moved subtly closer to the door. The room grew even quieter, as if it were waiting for the moment everything would finally reveal itself. Asterisk, but before the lining was fully opened, the lead officer stopped again. Asterisk, this time, he looked at the man directly and asked in a calm, steady voice. Asterisk, is there anything you want to tell us before we continue? Asterisk, the question hung in the air like a weight, heavy, unmoving, unavoidable. Asterisk, and for the first time since he walked into the airport, the man wasn't sure if silence could protect him anymore. Asterisk. The room felt too quiet after the officer asked that question. It was the kind of quiet that didn't just fill the space, it pressed against the man's chest, making it harder to breathe. He kept his eyes on the table, trying to control the tremor moving through his hands. He knew this was the moment people talked themselves into or out of trouble. One wrong word, one wrong expression, and everything could shift. Asterisk, the officer waited patiently, almost kindly, which somehow made the pressure worse. The man could sense the other two officers watching him closely. Not aggressively, but observantly reading every small sign he couldn't hide. He didn't answer, not because he didn't want to, but because he couldn't. His mind felt heavy, dragging through memories, fears, and the secret he had spent years trying to outrun. If he spoke now, he feared his voice might give away more truth than he intended. The officer finally nodded, as if he expected the silence. Then he turned back to the backpack and gently widened the opening in the lining. The tool slid through the material slowly, exposing the thin layer that separated the outer fabric from whatever was hidden beneath it. The man's heartbeat grew louder. He felt every thump in his throat, in his temples, everywhere. He tried to steady his breathing, but each inhale felt shallow, like the air itself didn't want to enter his lungs. The officer paused again, frowning slightly in concentration. Then he reached inside the narrow space between the layers. His fingertips brushed against something, causing the material to move softly, not loudly, not dramatically, but enough to confirm that something solid was there, something that didn't belong in a bag's lining. The officer looked up at the man again, his expression shifting from curiosity to something more serious. Not anger, not accusation, just seriousness, the kind that comes when a situation goes from routine check to we need answers. Another officer stepped forward, closer to the table. We're going to need to take this out, he said gently. The man nodded, but the gesture felt mechanical. His throat was dry, and he couldn't look away from the bag, even if he wanted to. The officer inserted the tool deeper, and carefully loosened the fabric. Then, with slow and steady movements, he pulled back a thin piece of material, revealing the faint outline of something pressed tightly inside. The officers leaned in, their eyes narrowing slightly. The man felt his breath catch. There it was, the thing he had hidden so carefully, the thing he had kept close but never meant for anyone to find. The object wasn't fully exposed yet, but enough of its shape was visible that the officers exchanged glances, sharp, knowing glances that carried silent questions. The lead officer took a step back. We're going to need a senior inspector, he said quietly. Those words hit the man like a punch to the chest. A senior inspector meant escalation. It meant seriousness. It meant things were no longer just about unclear scanner images or routine procedure. One officer left the room to get the inspector. The door closed softly behind him, but the silence that followed was anything but soft. It was tense, heavy, filled with anticipation. The officer near the door watched the man carefully, but without hostility. The lead officer kept the bag in front of him, the lining still partially open, the hidden object still pressed deep inside like a secret not ready to show its full face. The man forced himself to breathe. But even that felt difficult. He thought about everything that had led him here, the years of trying to escape his own history, the mistakes that kept following him, the weight of regret that never fully left his shoulders. He thought about the people he had tried to protect. He thought about the promises he made to himself that he could never keep. He had told himself he wasn't running away. He had told himself he was searching for a new start. But the truth he never said out loud, was that he was running, not from the law, not from danger, but from the person he had become. And now, the past he thought he had outrun was catching him in the most unexpected place. An airport security room with 3 officers watching his every breath. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. The door opened, and a senior inspector walked in. His presence immediately changed the room. He had the kind of expression that showed years of experience, calm, sharp, unreadable. He walked to the table and examined the backpack without saying a word. He studied the scan image, then the partially opened lining, then the man's face. Not judgmental, just observant. Let's take a closer look, he said quietly. The lead officer stepped aside to give him room. The inspector leaned over the bag and reached inside the opening, with a level of precision that came from doing this countless times. He felt the hidden object with the tips of his fingers, testing its shape, size, and position. Then he withdrew his hand and looked at the man again, his expression shifting slightly, not surprise, but confirmation that something was definitely wrong. Do you understand why this concerns us? The inspector asked. The man felt his voice stuck somewhere deep inside. He nodded, but his throat felt too tight to speak. Before the inspector could say more, a soft sound came from the bag, a rustle from the inner layer, caused by the slight pressure of the inspector's touch. It wasn't loud, but in that silent room, even that small sound felt like a warning. The inspector glanced at the officers. We need to open the lining fully, he said. The word struck the man with full force. His breath faltered. He gripped the edge of the chair lightly to keep his hands from shaking. He knew what would happen once the lining was fully opened. The object inside would be revealed completely. There would be no more questions, no more hiding, no more silence. As the officers prepared tools for the full opening, the inspector stepped closer to the man. If there is anything we need to know, he said quietly, this is the time to tell us. Asterisk, the man's eyes dropped to the floor. His heart pounded so hard he felt dizzy. He wanted to speak, to defend himself, to explain that his story wasn't as simple as it looked, but the words wouldn't form. Asterisk, the inspector watched him for a long moment. Then he nodded softly and stepped back to the table. Asterisk, the officers positioned the backpack carefully, their movements steady and deliberate. The small opening in the lining was widened slowly, exposing more of the hidden object. Each centimeter of fabric peeled away increased the tension in the room and in the man's chest. Asterisk, finally. The inspector leaned in, fingers brushing the edge of the now visible shape. Its outline was clearer now, unmistakable, undeniable. The man's breathing grew shallow. The inspector looked at him one more time, not with anger, but with a calm understanding that something about this moment mattered more than the object itself. Asterisk, and then, with one slow and deliberate movement, he reached inside the lining and began to pull the hidden object out. The man's world felt like it stopped. Whatever happened next would change everything. Asterisk, and there was no turning back. As the inspector's fingers closed around the hidden object, the man's chest tightened with a mixture of fear and anticipation. For years, he had rehearsed what he would do if someone discovered this secret. He had imagined every reaction: disbelief, shock, anger, maybe even judgment. But none of those imagined scenarios prepared him for the way the inspector's eyes narrowed. A subtle shift that spoke of something he hadn't anticipated: suspicion and curiosity, combined in a way that made the air in the room feel even heavier. Asterisk, the object began to emerge from the lining, slow and deliberate, as if time itself had stretched to watch this moment. But just as the inspector lifted it enough to examine, a soft beep rang from the scanner monitor, startling everyone. The officers froze, exchanging quick glances. The sound wasn't loud, but it carried weight, an automated alert from the back-end security system. Something else had been triggered, something they hadn't seen at first. Asterisk, the man's pulse shot up. He didn't know what the scanner had detected, but he knew that whatever it wasn't in his control. He tried to mask his panic, forcing his hands to stay still in his lap, his face neutral. But the moment the inspector noticed the alert, the room's atmosphere shifted again. Calm curiosity transformed into tension, edged with urgency. Asterisk, wait, the inspector said, raising a hand. This isn't just the object we expected. His voice was measured, calm, but it carried an unspoken warning. There's another signal here. Something inside the bag, or maybe something on the person. Asterisk, the man's stomach dropped. He had hidden one secret carefully, but he hadn't anticipated a second one. Something that could be buried in plain sight. In layers even he hadn't considered vulnerable. He tried to recall if anything in his backpack or on his body could have triggered this. His mind raced, flicking through the years of preparation, the precautions he had taken, the countless times he had crossed borders, only to realize one small error could unravel everything. Asterisk, the officer who had been quietly observing stepped forward. Checking the scanner again, there's a metallic trace in a pocket lining, but the readings don't match any conventional item, he said, his tone even but deliberate, like he was alerting the team to an unknown variable. The words hit like a punch. An unknown variable meant uncertainty, and uncertainty in an airport security room meant escalation. Asterisk, the inspector frowned, leaning closer to the scanner screen. He swiped through the images, enlarging, rotating, comparing them to the previous scans. This is unusual, he murmured. Whatever this is, it's designed to avoid detection. But it's small, subtle, not accidental. Asterisk, the man felt sweat prick at his temples. He hadn't anticipated this. Not now. Not when he was already exposed. Years of caution had failed him in a fraction of a second. Every strategy he had relied on suddenly seemed insufficient. Asterisk, sir, the inspector said, turning back to him. We're going to need to verify a few more things about your personal items and your clothing. It may be nothing, but right now, nothing isn't a certainty. The calm tone belied the seriousness. In that one phrase, the stakes had doubled. The officers weren't just checking the bag anymore, they were considering him. Every item he carried, every move he had made, as part of the investigation. Asterisk, he nodded slowly, but inside, panic flared. He had spent years constructing a life where no one would suspect him. Now, that life felt like it was crumbling in seconds. The secret he had carried so carefully was no longer just a secret, it was a catalyst. And now it had triggered another layer of scrutiny that he couldn't predict or control. Asterisk, the inspector began to handle the hidden object again. Turning it in his hands, examining it from every angle, his movements were precise, professional, but his gaze kept flicking toward the man, as if measuring his reaction, testing his composure. Every twitch of muscle, every small hesitation, every involuntary gesture became a potential clue, and the man felt as if every second was a test he was failing silently. Asterisk, suddenly, the officer monitoring the scanner spoke up again. There's something else. An anomaly on the body scanner. It's faint, almost imperceptible, but it's there. His voice, calm as it was, carried weight, like the discovery of a hidden chapter in a story that was already dangerous enough. Asterisk, the man froze. He had prepared for the bag. He had calculated every risk involving the object inside, but he hadn't prepared for something on his person, something that could link him to the hidden secret, expose his history, or leave him vulnerable in ways he couldn't predict. The second plot twist was real, immediate, and it escalated the tension beyond anything he had rehearsed. Asterisk, the inspector straightened, turning sharply toward the man. We need to conduct a full secondary screening, not just the bag, your personal items, clothing, everything. It may take time, but we need full clarity before you continue. Asterisk, the man's throat tightened. He nodded, but words felt impossible. He had known borders could be dangerous. He had known scanners were thorough. He had known mistakes could ruin lives. But he hadn't imagined an escalation like this, the combination of exposure and new unknown variables, twisting a controlled situation into a web he couldn't untangle. Asterisk, he glanced at the officers. Their faces remained neutral, professional, composed, but the intensity in their eyes made it clear they were no longer treating this as a routine inspection. They were now following protocol for something that could have consequences far beyond a simple security check. Asterisk, the room grew quieter again. Heavy with anticipation, the bag sat on the table, partially open, its secret partially revealed. The scanner continued to hum softly, signaling anomalies on both the object and his person. The man's heart raced. Every passing second was measured, observed, noted. Every slight movement he made was a potential clue. Asterisk, and then, in that tense silence, the inspector looked up again, fixing him with a calm but piercing gaze. You understand that at this point, full disclosure is your best option, he said. Asterisk, the man swallowed, feeling the weight of years pressing down on him. His secret had been exposed. Partially, a new anomaly had appeared, complicating everything. Every option he had considered, every strategy he had rehearsed, was suddenly insufficient. Asterisk, and in that moment, as the officers prepared to continue the inspection, he realized the climax of his hidden story wasn't just approaching. It was here. Asterisk, everything he had tried to hide, every precaution he had taken, every layer of secrecy, was about to collide in ways he could no longer predict. The tension in the room was electric, silent, suffocating, and he knew that the next moments would determine whether he could maintain control, or if everything would unravel completely. Asterisk. The inspector's hands moved deliberately, carefully, as if handling something fragile yet dangerous. The hidden object, now fully exposed from the lining, revealed itself clearly under the sterile lighting of the inspection room. It wasn't what anyone had expected, not the kind of item that would immediately suggest danger, but enough to trigger alarms, enough to cast doubt. Its presence explained why the scanners had flagged the bag, why the officers had escalated their attention, why every second had felt like a countdown toward disaster. Asterisk, the man's chest heaved as the inspector held the object carefully. Examining it, it was a small metallic device, not harmful in itself, but highly unusual. The kind of item that required documentation, verification, and strict protocol. Its design hinted at careful planning, something someone had gone to lengths to conceal. And in that moment, the man realized that his life, his years of trying to stay hidden, depended entirely on how he explained it. Asterisk, sir, the inspector said, looking directly at him. Calm, but firm. This device is highly irregular. Can you explain why it's in your bag? Asterisk, the man swallowed hard. For years, he had rehearsed answers for almost every possibility, but the weight of reality pressed down on him. Slowly, carefully, he began to speak, choosing words to bridge truth and explanation. It's a prototype. I'm an engineer. It's part of my work. I was testing a design. I didn't think it would trigger alarms. I didn't mean any harm. Asterisk, the inspector's gaze never wavered. He examined the man's face, reading micro-expressions, evaluating tone, assessing the credibility of every syllable. The officers around the table remained quiet, attentive, professional, yet every subtle gesture reflected the tension in the room. Asterisk, after a long pause, the inspector nodded slightly, as if weighing the answer against evidence and instinct. We'll need to verify that. It may be legitimate, but the anomaly on your scanner results, we can't ignore that. You understand why this is serious, correct? Asterisk, the man nodded. A wave of relief, mixed with fear, washing over him. He had come close to being exposed completely, and now, carefully, he was regaining a small measure of control. But just as the tension seemed to ease, another officer tapped the scanner screen and furrowed his brow. Asterisk, there's another reading. The officer said quietly, it's faint, but it appears to be coming from the lining of the bag. And your clothing, it doesn't match the device, not at all. Asterisk, the man froze. He had thought the device was the only source of concern, the only secret at risk. But now a new anomaly appeared, one he hadn't anticipated, one that threatened everything he had just begun to clarify. The inspector turned sharply, examining the readings. This is unusual, could be a false positive, but given the prior anomaly, we need to investigate further. Asterisk, the man's heart pounded. His mind raced through every possibility. every precaution he had taken. Nothing explained this new alert. He had accounted for the bag, the device, the lining, even personal items. But his own clothing, that wasn't possible. The officer carefully inspected his jacket and found a tiny compartment stitched inside, almost invisible, containing a small memory card. Its existence startled even the most experienced officers in the room. It was a subtle, almost imperceptible addition, yet significant enough to justify the alert. The man's eyes widened. That card had been placed there years ago, in a moment he thought was private, forgotten, a backup, a precaution he had never intended to carry across borders. And now, decades later, it had resurfaced at the worst possible time. The inspector carefully removed the card and examined it under a magnifier. This contains data, he said. Files, documents, not dangerous, but sensitive. It explains the anomalies, but why it remained hidden, that's what we need to understand. The man took a deep breath, realizing he had no way to hide the truth. Now, slowly, he explained, it's my work, personal research, things I didn't want anyone to misplace or misuse. I thought I had secured it. I forgot it was there. I swear, I never intended for this to cause suspicion. The inspector studied him silently for a moment, then looked at the other officers. It appears to be harmless, but unusual enough to cause alarm. Protocol requires that we document everything. The relief was palpable in the man's chest, yet it was fragile because the tension hadn't fully lifted. The officers were calm, professional, but every decision, every action was still critical. The climax had arrived. Exposure, explanation, verification. Just as he thought the ordeal might be over, the inspector's phone buzzed with a soft alert. He glanced down at it, frowning slightly. There's a report from the scanner network, he said. A similar anomaly was detected on another terminal. Same type of device, same pattern. The man's stomach dropped. Another alert, another investigation. Could it be related to him, or someone else? The revelation was sudden, unexpected, and it added a new layer of complexity. The inspector looked up, expression unreadable. It appears you're not the only one traveling with this type of device. We're going to need further investigation, including authorities at the destination. You'll need to remain available for questioning until everything is verified. For the man, the relief and the fear collided. He had survived the immediate scrutiny, explained the first anomaly, resolved the conflict over the hidden device, but now a new variable emerged, one that hinted at a larger mystery he hadn't anticipated. As he nodded, accepting the inspector's instructions, a small, unexpected twist emerged in his mind. Even though he had navigated the scrutiny, the exposure of the memory card, and the verification of his story, the revelation of the network alert suggested that his carefully hidden world was not as private as he thought. Someone else, somewhere, was connected to the same secret he had carried alone for years. The tension didn't fully release. It transformed, from immediate danger to a lingering uncertainty, a question that would follow him beyond the airport. His journey was far from over. The object was resolved. His story explained. The conflicts addressed, yet a deeper mystery now awaited him, one that promised to pull him into challenges he had never imagined. And as the inspectors finalized their notes and prepared to release him for now, the man realized the climax was over, but the story wasn't finished. Not by a long shot. A single glance at the memory card, carefully tucked in his pocket, reminded him some secrets, even when revealed, have a way of resurfacing at the worst possible moment. The tension in the room finally began to ease, though a subtle weight remained. The inspectors had documented everything, the backpack and hidden device verified, and the memory card accounted for. The anomalies, while unusual, had proven to be not. For the first time in hours, the man allowed himself a slow, steady breath. He had survived the scrutiny, navigated the inspections, and explained the irregularities in a way that satisfied protocol. Yet the lingering alert from the scanner network reminded him that his story was only partly told. The officers began to step back, carefully repacking the backpack and returning personal items. Each movement was deliberate, precise, professional, and yet the sense of finality in their actions felt reassuring. The inspector glanced at him one last time, his expression calm but evaluative. You've been cooperative. That helps. Keep in mind though, any similar items you carry in the future will undergo the same scrutiny. The man nodded, keeping his voice even. I understand. I'll make sure everything is declared properly from now on. There was relief in his tone, though beneath it lay a quiet, reflective awareness of the precariousness of his life, how easily one small oversight could have escalated into a catastrophe. As the officers filed out, the man stayed seated for a moment, letting himself absorb the stillness. The fluorescent lights above hummed softly, and the distant sounds of the terminal, announcements, rolling luggage, footsteps began to seep back in. For hours, he had been trapped in a world of observation, silence, and anticipation. Now, as normalcy returned, he felt the emotional weight of what had just happened. Asterisk, he thought about the past, the careful precautions, the hidden devices, the memory card tucked away years ago. Every choice, every step, every layer of secrecy had been calculated, but it had brought him to the brink. And yet, in surviving the immediate crisis, he realized something important. Secrecy alone could not protect him from the unexpected. No matter how careful he had been, life had a way of revealing the things we most try to hide. Asterisk, a wave of reflection washed over him. He had lived in fear of exposure for so long that the idea of transparency, of explaining his actions truthfully, felt almost foreign. Yet now he recognized the value of clarity. The inspectors hadn't judged him. They had observed, questioned, and followed protocol, but their approach had been fair, precise, and professional. It was a reminder that, often, facing scrutiny honestly could prevent far worse outcomes than avoidance ever could. Asterisk, he carefully packed his backpack again, checking the lining and making sure the memory card was secured properly. He realized the small mistakes, oversights, or forgotten precautions that had triggered hours of tension were as much lessons as they were warnings. He had to adapt, think ahead, and respect the systems designed to keep others safe, even when they felt intrusive or inconvenient. Asterisk, as he walked out of the security room and returned to the main terminal, the busy noise of travelers, announcements, and rolling luggage felt almost comforting. Life had returned to its normal rhythm, but he knew he carried a quiet awareness, now a deepened understanding of accountability, foresight, and the thin line between careful planning and unforeseen consequence. Asterisk, he glanced down at the memory card once more. Its presence was now less a source of fear and more a symbol of responsibility. He promised himself that every secret he carried, every precaution he took, would be handled with care, transparency, and integrity. Lessons learned from the intense scrutiny would shape his decisions moving forward. Asterisk, as he approached the gate for his flight, he noticed other travelers absorbed in their routines, unaware of the intense hours he had endured. He realized that appearances could be deceiving. People often seemed ordinary, even vulnerable, but everyone carries their own private struggles, hidden decisions, and unspoken stories. His experience had reminded him that understanding, patience, and careful attention to detail were vital, not just for security officers, but for anyone navigating life's uncertainties. Asterisk, the boarding process was smooth, uneventful, a stark contrast to the tension he had just endured. He placed his backpack in the overhead bin, double-checked his personal items, and settled into his seat. The hum of the plane, the distant chatter of passengers, and the anticipation of departure felt like a release, a return to a world where movement, progress, and ordinary life could resume. Asterisk, yet even in this ordinary moment, he couldn't completely shake the awareness of the recent events. The knowledge that a similar anomaly had appeared elsewhere, the faint signals he hadn't expected, lingered in his mind. It was a reminder that life's surprises often arrive when least anticipated, and vigilance, honesty, and careful planning were essential tools to navigate the unexpected. Asterisk, the plane doors closed, and the engines roared to life. He watched the runway stretch out beneath him, feeling a mix of relief, reflection, and quiet anticipation. The ordeal was over, the immediate conflict resolved, but the lessons remained. He had faced scrutiny, revealed long-hidden truths, and learned that integrity and transparency were powerful shields in a world of unpredictability. Asterisk, as the plane lifted off, he allowed himself to relax slightly, thinking about the next steps in his journey, both literal and metaphorical. He would continue traveling, continue his work, continue living, but with a renewed sense of responsibility. He had seen how quickly secrets could surface, how tension could escalate, and how unforeseen factors could reshape everything. The experience had changed him, not in fear, but in wisdom. Asterisk, the memory card, now safely secured, symbolized more than the past. It represented awareness, the understanding that every decision carries consequences, and the importance of preparation without obsession. The hidden device, the anomalies, the scrutiny, all were reminders that life demands attention, careful planning, and honesty. Asterisk, as the plane soared above the clouds, he looked out the window at the sprawling city below. Bathed in the golden light of late afternoon, he felt a quiet sense of accomplishment. He had faced a potentially catastrophic situation, navigated complex challenges, and emerged intact. But more importantly, he had learned that even the most carefully hidden secrets must eventually be met with transparency, understanding, and accountability. Asterisk, and just as he settled into the rhythm of flight, a thought crossed his mind, the kind that lingered like a whisper. Even when the immediate danger is over, the world still holds mysteries, challenges, and surprises waiting to be encountered. Life doesn't end with a single resolution. It moves forward, unpredictable and complex, reminding us that vigilance, integrity, and careful reflection are not just reactions, but lifelong tools. Asterisk, with a deep, steadying breath, he allowed himself to look ahead, not in fear, but with clarity. The climax of his ordeal was behind him, the main conflicts resolved, the lessons clear, and yet, the story of vigilance, secrecy, and the unexpected would remain with him, quietly shaping every decision he made. every step he took. In every journey he embarked upon, the man smiled faintly, a mixture of relief and reflection. He had survived, learned, and grown, and though the journey ahead remained uncertain, he felt prepared to face it with a new perspective. Secrets, he realized, were only dangerous when left unchecked. Honesty, awareness, and careful attention to life's hidden layers were what truly allowed a person to move forward safely. As the plane climbed higher into the sky, leaving the city and the terminal behind, he settled back into his seat, letting the hum of engines and the quiet conversations around him ease the tension. He closed his eyes for a moment, reflecting on the ordeal, the hidden device, the anomalies, the inspector's scrutiny, and the lessons that would shape his path forward. And in that moment, he understood something essential. The most intense conflicts, the most suspenseful moments, and the hidden truths all serve a purpose. They reveal not just vulnerability, but resilience. They teach caution, preparation, and honesty. They remind us that life's hidden layers, no matter how carefully concealed, are part of the story we live, and when faced directly, can guide us toward clarity, growth, and a wiser future. The journey was far from over, but for now, he was ready to move forward, carrying the lessons, the reflections, and the quiet understanding that even when secrets surface, it's the way we respond that defines the next chapter of our lives.